Peace. Just getting started. Give me a moment. Trying to do something here. But I hope your day going good. Okay. But I hope your day going good. Okay, we got that going. Just give me a few minutes. Just trying something different. Trying something new. Nothing for y'all. Just something for me to make sure I can do certain things later. So, okay, that's what I'm talking about. All right, so let's get back to here. Peace. All right, so today I guess the woman I want to recognize today is Septima Poinsett Clark. She was born May 3rd, 1898 to December 15th, 1987. So I believe she was 89 years old. Was an American educator and civil rights activist. Clark developed the literacy and citizenship workshops that played the ever most important role in a drive for voting rights and civil rights for African Americans in the civil rights movement. Septima Clark's work was commonly underappreciated by Southern male activists. She became known as the Queen Mother or Grandmother of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. commonly referred to Clark as the mother of the movement. Clark's argument for her position in the Civil Rights Movement was one that claimed knowledge could empower marginalized groups in ways that formal legal equality couldn't. So when you get a second, go ahead and look up Septima Poinsett Clark. She from Charleston, South Carolina. She was born in 1898. There's tons of information about her online, but as we attempt to set the tone for the brothers that are out here to show that they appreciate the sisters, I just wanted to honor her today. You know, that may be someone you guys never heard of, but she was very important and significant in what was going on with us as far as the movement. Okay, so let me see if I can also do this while I'm here. Get this out the way. Okay. All right. So today is the new Jim Crow, picking and choosing the role of discretion. Hey, you know what? We're gonna have ideas that clash, and we may not agree at all times. So we just got to learn to agree to disagree. But we can't keep standing, man, around just looking. Y'all see what happened with the brothers out there, man, yesterday in Pittsburgh. That's terrible that our children are being gunned down. And people want us to be on the front line for everything else, for everybody else. But if you would nip the problem in the bud where it's been prevalent in our community, you wouldn't even have to worry about any of this with anybody else's community because we would set the bar and we would set the tone. Okay, so I'm going to hop right into this today. Let me back up a little bit. Picking and choosing, the role of discretion. Chapter 2 described the first step in some detail, including the legal rules that grant police the discretion and authority to stop, interrogate, and search anyone, anywhere, provided they get consent from the targeted individual. It has also examined the legal framework that affords prosecutors extraordinary discretion to charge or not charge, plea bargain or not, and load up defendants with charges carrying the threat of harsh mandatory sentences in order to force guilty pleas, even in cases in which the defendants may be well innocent. These rules have made it possible for law enforcement agencies to boost dramatically their rates of drug arrests and convictions, even in communities where drug crime is stable or declining. But that is not all. These rules have also guaranteed racially discriminatory results. The reason is this: drug law enforcement is unlike most other types of law enforcement. When a violent crime or robbery or trespass occurs, someone usually calls the police. There is a clear victim and perpetrator. Someone is hurt or harmed in some way and wants the offender punished. But with drug crime, Neither the purchaser of the drugs nor the seller has any incentive to contact law enforcement. It is consensual activity. Equally important, it is popular. The clear majority of Americans of all races have violated drug laws in their lifetime. In fact, in any given year, more than 1 in 10 Americans violated drug laws. But due to resource constraints and the politics of the drug war, only a small fraction are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated. In 2002, for example, there were 19.5 million illicit drug users compared to 1.5 million drug arrests and 175,000 people admitted to prison for a drug offense. The ubiquity of illegal drug activity combined with its consensual nature requires a far more proactive approach by law enforcement than what is required to address ordinary street crime. It is impossible for law enforcement to identify and arrest every drug criminal. Strategic choices must be made about whom to target and what tactics to employ. Police and prosecutors did not declare the war on drugs, and some initially opposed it. But once the financial incentives for waging the war became too attractive to ignore, law enforcement agencies had to ask themselves, if we're going to wage this war, where should it be fought and who should be taken prisoner? The question was not difficult to answer, given the political and social context. As discussed in Chapter 1, the Reagan administration launched a media campaign a few years after the drug war was announced in an effort to publicize horror stories of black crack users and crack dealers in ghetto communities. Pardon me. Although crack cocaine had not yet hit the streets when the war on drugs was declared in 1982. Seeing how this connection is going? It never hit the streets. It hadn't hit the streets yet, but they already had the war on drugs. How did they know that the war on drugs was coming unless they were going to implement it? And how did they know what communities it was going to hit unless they already targeted the communities? Okay, let me read that again. Although crack cocaine had not yet hit the streets when the war on drugs was declared in 82, its appearance a few years later created the perfect opportunity for the Reagan administration to build support for its new war. Drug use, once considered a private public health matter, was reframed through political rhetoric and media imagery as a grave threat to the national order. Jimmy Reeves and Richard Campbell show in their research how the media imagery surrounding cocaine changed as the practice of smoking cocaine became associated with poor blacks. Early in the 80s, the typical cocaine-related story focused on white recreational users who snorted the drug in its powder form. These stories generally relied on news sources associated with the drug treatment industry, such as rehabilitation clinics, and emphasized the possibility of recovery. By 1985, however, as the war on drugs moved into high gear, this frame was supplanted by a new siege paradigm in which transgressors were poor, non-white users, and dealers of crack cocaine. Law enforcement officials assumed the role of drug experts, emphasizing the need for law and order responses, a crackdown on those associated with the drug. These findings are consistent with numerous other studies, including a study of network television news from 1990 and 91, which found that a predictable against them frame that a predictable us against them frame was used in the news stories, with us being white suburban America and them being black Americans and few corrupted whites. The media bonanza inspired by the administration's campaign solidified in the public imagination the image of the black drug criminal. Although explicitly racial political appeals remained rare, the cause for war at a time when the media was saturated with images of black drug crime left little doubt about who the enemy was in the drug wars and exactly what he looked like. Jerome Miller, the former executive director of the National Center for Institutions and Alternatives, described the dynamic this way. There are certain code words that allow you never to have to say race, but everybody knows that's what you mean, and crime is one of those. So when we talk about locking up more and more people, what we're really talking about is locking up more and more black men. Another commentator noted, it is unnecessary to speak directly of race today because speaking about crime is talking about race. Indeed, not long after the drug war was ramped up in the media and the political discourse, almost no one imagined that drug criminals could be anything other than black. A survey was conducted in 1995 asking the following questions. Would you close your eyes for a second, envision a drug user, and describe that person to me? The starting results that were published in the Journal of Alcohol and Drug Education, 95% of respondents pictured a black drug user, while only 5% imagined other racial groups. These results contrast sharply with the reality of the drug crime in America. African Americans constituted only 15% of current drug users in 1995, and they constitute roughly the same percentage today. Whites constituted the vast majority of drug users then and now, but almost no one pictured a white person when asked to imagine what a drug user looks like. The same group of respondents also perceived the typical drug trafficker as black. There is no reason to believe that the survey results would have been any different if the police officers or prosecutors, rather than the general public, had been the respondents. Law enforcement officials, no less than the rest of us, have been exposed to the racially charged political rhetoric and media imagery associated with the drug war. In fact, for nearly 3 decades, news stories regarding virtually all street crime have disproportionately featured African American offenders. One study suggests that the standard crime news script is so prevalent and so thoroughly racialized that viewers imagine a black perpetrator even when none exists. In that study, 60% of viewers who saw a story with no image falsely recalled seeing one, and 70% of those viewers believed the perpetrator to be African American. Decades of cognitive bias research demonstrates that both unconscious and conscious biases lead to discriminatory actions, even when an individual does not want to discriminate. The quotation commonly attributed to Nietzsche, that there is no immaculate perception, perfectly captures how cognitive schemas throughout structures influence what we notice and how the things we notice get interpreted. Studies have shown that the racial schemas operate not only as a part of conscious racial deliberations, but also automatically, without conscious awareness or intent. One study, for example, involved a video game that placed photographs of white and black individuals holding either a gun or other objects, such as a wallet, soda can, or cell phone, into various photographic backgrounds. Participants were told to decide as quickly as possible whether to shoot the target. Consistent with earlier studies, participants were more likely to mistake a black target as armed when he was not, and mistake a white target as unarmed, when in fact he was armed. This pattern of discrimination reflected automatic unconscious thought processes, not careful deliberations. Most striking, perhaps, is the overwhelming evidence that implicit bias measures are disassociated from explicit bias measures. In other words, the fact that you may honestly believe that you are not biased against African Americans and that you may even have black friends or relatives does not mean that you are free from unconscious bias. Implicit bias tests may still show that you hold negative attitudes and stereotypes about blacks, even though you do not believe you do and do not want to. In a study described above, for example, black participants showed an amount of shooter bias similar to that shown by whites. Not surprisingly, people who have the greatest explicit bias, as measured by self-reported answers to survey questions, against the greatest implicit bias against them, and vice versa. Yet there is often a weak correlation between degrees of explicit and implicit bias. Many people who think they are not biased prove, when tested, to have relatively high levels of bias. Unfortunately, a fairly consistent finding is that punitiveness and hostility almost always increase when people are primed, even subliminally, with images or verbal cues associated with African Americans. In fact, studies indicate that people become increasingly harsh when an alleged criminal is darker and more stereotypically black. They are more lenient when the accused is lighter and appears more stereotypically white. This is true of jurors as well as law enforcement officers. Viewed as a whole, the relevant research by cognitive and social psychologists to date suggests that racial biases in the drug war was inevitable. Once a public consensus was constructed by political and media elites that drug crime is black and brown. Once blackness and crime, especially drug crime, became conflated in the public consciousness, the criminal black man, as termed by the legal scholar Catherine Russell, would inevitably become the primary target of law enforcement. Some discrimination would be conscious and deliberate, as many honestly and consciously will believe that black men deserve extra scrutiny and harsh treatment. Much racial bias, though, would operate unconsciously and automatically, even among law enforcement officials genuinely committed to equal treatment under the law. Whether or not one believes racial discrimination in the drug war was inevitable, it should have been glaringly obvious in the 80s and the 90s that an extraordinarily high risk of racial bias in the administration of criminal justice was present, given the way in which all crime had been framed in the media and in political discourse. Awareness of this risk did not require intimate familiarity with cognitive bias research. Anyone possessing a television set during this period will likely have had some awareness of the extent to which black men have been demonized in the war on drugs. The risk that African Americans would unfairly be targeted should have been of special concern to the United States Supreme Court, the one branch of government charged with the responsibility of protecting discrete and insular minorities from the excesses of majoritarian democracy and guaranteeing constitutional rights for groups deemed unpopular or subject to prejudice. Yet when the time came for the Supreme Court to devise the legal rules that would govern the war on drugs, the court adopted rules that would maximize, not minimize, the amount of racial discrimination that would likely occur. It then closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias. Wren versus the United States is a case in point. As noted in Chapter 2, the court held in Wren that police officers are free to use minor traffic violations as an excuse to stop motorists for drug investigations, even when there is no evidence whatsoever that the motorist has engaged in drug crime. So long as a minor traffic violation, such as failing to use the turn signal, exceeding the speed limit by a mile or two, tracking improperly between the lines, or stopping on a pedestrian walkway, can be identified, police are free to stop motorists for the purpose of engaging in a fishing expedition of drugs. Such police conduct, the court concluded, does not violate the Fourth Amendment's ban on unreasonable searches and seizures. For good reason, the petitioners in Wren argued that granting police officers such broad discretion to investigate virtually anyone for drug crimes created a high risk that police would exercise their discretion in a racially discriminatory manner, which they have continued to do since then. With no requirement that any evidence of drug activity actually be present before launching a drug investigation, police officers' snap judgments regarding who seems like a drug criminal would likely be influenced by prevailing racial stereotypes and bias. They urged the court to prohibit the police from stopping motorists for the purpose of drug investigations unless the officers actually had reason to believe a motorist was committing or had committed a drug crime. Failing to do so, they argued, was unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment and would expose African Americans to discriminatory stops and searches. Not only did the court reject the petitioner's central claim that using traffic stops as a pretext for drug investigations is unconstitutional, and it is, it ruled that claims of racial bias cannot be brought under the Fourth Amendment. In other words, the court barred any victim of race discrimination by the police from even alleging a claim of racial bias under the Fourth Amendment. According to the court, whether or not the police discriminate on the basis of race in making traffic stops is irrelevant to consideration of whether their conduct is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. The court did offer one caveat, however. It indicated that victims of race discrimination could still state a claim under the Equal Protection Clause of the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees equal treatment under the laws. This suggestion may have been reassuring to those unfamiliar with the court's equal protection jurisprudence. But for those who have actually tried to prove race discrimination under the Fourth Amendment, the court's remark amounted to cruel irony, as we shall see below. The Supreme Court has made it virtually impossible to challenge racial bias in the criminal justice system under the 14th Amendment, and it has barred litigation of such claims under federal civil rights laws as well. Closing the courthouse doors. That'll be next. I'm going to stop this here. I just wanted to say, what's up, black people? I love you. I hope your day is great. And next time we get into this, we're going to be talking about closing the courthouse doors. McCleskey versus Kemp. I hope your day is great. I hope your tomorrow is greater. Black people, I love you. You're significant. And our solidarity is needed. So we need to just come together on a daily basis until we get it together. We need to have these conversations. We shouldn't have to wait for the news to talk about what's going on when we can talk about it amongst ourselves. The news doesn't cater to us. The media doesn't cater to us. The police do not cater to us. The courthouse, the legal branch of the law does not cater to us. They try to use us as their muses. So I'm just saying, black people, buy black, think black, be proud to be black, stay black. Peace.